Anna Malavisi is a philosopher, development ethicist, and peace activist. She is Associate Professor and Associate Chair of the Department of History, Philosophy, and World Perspectives at Western Connecticut State University. She received her PhD from Michigan State University and her Master of Health and International Development degree from Flinders University of South Australia. Her research interests include practical and global ethics, social and political thought, feminist philosophy, peace and nonviolence, and environmental philosophy. She's fluent in Spanish and spent 16 years working in international development in Latin America, primarily in Bolivia, working for 8 years in national NGOs. For the next 8 years, she managed the Bolivian Program for International Service, a British-based NGO that supported local organizations with skilled human resources in the areas of agriculture, water, forestry, health, and other areas. Anna has produced a number of publications on development ethics and related issues, including a book titled Global Development, Ethics, and Epistemic Injustice, Rethinking the Theory and Practice. Please join me in welcoming Anna Malavisi for her lecture, War on the Environment. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Josh. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for coming to this talk. First of all, I'd like to thank Josh and the university, the president, for this wonderful initiative. When Josh first invited me to give a talk, and he said he was the director of the Center for Global Humanities, I thought, wow, that's a great title and a great sort of thing to have. As a philosopher, sometimes we get sort of a bad rap, right? Philosophy's undervalued. We get, we're just up in the clouds. We're not, engaged with real problems. Well, I identify myself as an engaged philosopher, which means I engage philosophical thinking with everyday issues. And today I'm going to talk about two big issues that are confronting our world at the moment. But once again, I'd just like to thank the university and Josh in particular, and Neil too. They've done a great job in organizing this. So I'm going to start. And I'm going to start by sharing a passage first and then a couple of quotes, just to sort of set the context. So this is a passage from a classic Chinese text called the Tao Te Ching. It was written in 400 BCE, which means it's more than 2,400 years old. It was attributed to Lao Tzu, who was a Chinese philosopher. However, scholars since then have done a lot of research and think that there are a few more authors probably involved in the text. But this is just one passage, and I'm going to read it to you. It's titled Defense and Aggression. Those on the path of the great integrity never use military force to conquer others. Every aggressive act harvests its own counter-terrorism. Wherever the military marches, the killing fields lay waste to the land, yielding years of famine and misery. When attacked, those on the path of the great integrity defend themselves benevolently, never revenging. Achieve success without arrogance, without seeking glory, and without violating others. Aggression leeches our strength and humanity, subverting the great integrity and inviting disaster. The second is a quote by Noam Chomsky, one of the most well-known dissidents in the US, one of the best well-known public intellectuals, linguist, social theorist, philosopher, whatever. And he says this: human intelligence, in its unique glory, has contrived two mechanisms to destroy us and much else: nuclear weapons and environmental catastrophe, closely linked. It has yet to contrive the cure for the lethal malady, a task that must be undertaken without delay. And the last one is just a quote by a writer, Mark Kolansky, in an interview that he did with the New York Times, who said, he wished more authors would denounce war. There are too many books celebrating it. So the outline of my talk this afternoon is the following. So that was part of my introduction, but I'm going to continue with a little bit of an introduction. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about war and its justification. Then go on to talking parts of sort of like the essence of being human, right? What that means. And then the impact of war on the environment, which I'm going to concentrate more on the long-term impacts of war, not so much the short-term. I think they're pretty obvious. And then try and sort of think a little bit about, okay, so what needs to happen? Which will then lead on to some concluding thoughts. And then I'm very happy would love to engage with many of you. If you have questions, please, feel free to challenge me as well on some of my ideas and some of my thoughts. So this is a principal claim that I'm putting out there. To address the climate crisis, there is a need to better understand the impact that war has on the environment, but also challenge current political ideology that too easily justifies the onset of war as the only solution to conflict. And just a sort of like a footnote, the way I'm using ideology is in the Marxist sense. So ideology for Marx was a system of beliefs that was used to cover or obscure the nature of reality, which were often not true and deceptive. And I've put here a number of supporting claims or sort of premises that I think are really, really important, that to be able to address the situation that we're confronted with. So we need to extend the moral community to include non-human beings and the entire ecosystem. And this has been something that ethicists had left out, sort of like originally for many years. I mean, if we think about traditional ethics in the sort of like the ancient Greek, Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, right? Their main emphasis was talking about sort of humans, right? But environmental ethicists, environmental philosophers have since realized the importance of extending that moral community to non-human beings, but not only to non-human beings, but also to the entire ecosystem. In a sense, giving intrinsic value to not only humans and non-humans, but also to the rivers, to the seas, to the mountains. In other words, we have to reject an anthropocentric worldview. Anthropocentric just means human-centered. And we have, for centuries, we could say probably, since humans have been sort of on this earth, that we have more or less approached the way that we live or the way that we think and the way that we do from an anthropocentric worldview. We have not really thought about the impact of our actions or what they have had on the environment. We've just really used the environment as having instrumental value and not as having intrinsic value. And I think that's what we're witnessing today is a result of that exploitation and abuse, if you like. So what we need to think about is more of what environmental ethicists talk about as an ecocentric or a biocentric worldview, which does take into account non-human beings and the ecosystem. I'm not going to go into much detail about what that entails, but if people are interested in that and the question and answers, please feel free. Another sort of premise that I think is equally important is that all human lives have equal moral worth. I think too often in our society globally, some human lives are given priority over others. I think that needs to change. We also have to sort of cultivate the ability to let go the notion that war is the best and only alternative to resolve conflict or even defend one's land. Also, I think we have to get better at and realizing that we have the ability to use and use the faculty that's been endowed to us of rational and deliberate decision-making to reject certain ideologies. So going back to Immanuel Kant was a philosopher of the Enlightenment period. And he was the one that put forward one of the most famous ethical theories based on duty and obligation. It's actually probably morally more demanding than a utilitarian view. But one of the features of that ethical theory is that all humans regardless, irrespective of race, gender, sexuality, disability, etc., have equal moral worth. Okay, sorry, just going. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about war and its justification. So many will say that humanity has always engaged in war, so we're never going to be able to change that. I'm going to reject that notion and challenge it. War in the West is rooted in classical Roman and biblical Hebraic culture. It contains both religious and secular elements. We can think about, rationales for war can be found in the writings of theologians such as Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, but also secular theorists such as Cicero and many others. Right? So when we think about the history of war, has it always been around? When did it start? Right? Well, scant evidence shows that organised warfare existed before 4000 BCE, so it's gone back a long time. Right? Most anthropological findings suggest that warfare first appeared around 6,000 years ago. Now, some historians speculate that humans were free of such large-scale violence for most of the preceding 100,000 years. Now, I'm a little bit more skeptical about that. I'm not really sure that we can say that it was, free of large-scale violence, but maybe we should give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think it's probably really hard for us to really know the truth there, because going so far back. So as a result of many of the writings from Augustine and Aquinas, a just war theory has been created and put forward and often used as a justification for war. But as we all know, that theories are theories, and sometimes they don't work so well in the practice. And sometimes actions are justified in the name of theories, but when really it's not the case. Right? But just war theory is a Western concept. And it's, has two main categories: jus ad bellum, which is really the right to wage war, right? And jus in bello, really just the justice in war, what happens during war. And there are 6 principles of just war theory. The first one is there needs to be a just cause, right? The war is an attempt to avert the right kind of injury, if you like. It needs to be waged by a legitimate authority. The war is fought by an entity that has the authority to fight such wars. There needs to be a right intention that intends to achieve the just cause, rather than using it as an excuse to achieve some wrongful end. And we know that sometimes wars have been justified in a sense, but for a wrongful end. There need to be reasonable prospects of success. It's likely to achieve its aims. Proportionality. The morally weighted goods achieved by war outweigh the morally weighted bads that it will cause. And of course, the last one is it needs to be the last resort. Right? There is no other less harmful way to achieve the just cause, which may not be the case. I think more often than not, it's seen as the first point of action, or the first thing to do, rather than going to, say, negotiations. Now, Margaret Mead, a famous anthropologist, wrote a seminal piece back in the 1940s titled "War is Not Biological." She says, "Warfare is an invention like any other of the inventions, such as writing, marriage, cooking our food instead of eating it raw, trial by jury, or burial of the dead, and so on. If people have an idea of going to war, and the idea that war is the way in certain situations, they will sometimes go to war." So what does she say about this? She says, because it is an invention, we need an invention to replace it. But 2 conditions are necessary. The people recognize the defects of the old invention, and someone must make a new one. I can't help feeling that we're stuck in the first one. That not enough of us recognize that the old invention is defective. So these are just sort of some of the political ideologies today that are that make our political leaders resort to war as the only response, right? There's a rising trend toward nationalism, and this is globally and has been. And you might want to say there have been trends, and this is all something that's happened, but there does seem to be an increasing amount of nationalism globally in the last 10 to 20 years. And when I mean nationalism, I want to distinguish it from patriotism. Whether patriotism may be sort of like more of a passive sort of pride for your country and supporting it and thinking, whereas nationalism restricts it in the sense of there's a sort of, it encultures a superiority, a sort of power, and is a more aggressive form of pride in your country, if you like. And it's often the case that national self-interests outweigh the interest and needs of other countries. There seems to be a complete disconnect between war and the environment, right? So, and that's not all across the board, but at the same time, we talk about war on one side, and then we talk about the environment over this side, and we sort of think, hang on a minute. I mean, the fact that war has such a detrimental impact on the environment should be reason enough for the governments to say, hang on a minute, we've got to do something about this, right? But that doesn't seem to be that connection. Some lives are deemed ungrievable, unfortunately. Economic benefits from war outweigh the moral senselessness. And this has something to do with the national self-interests. And I think we're seeing that in many countries. Technology has changed the face of war and will continue to do so. The advent of AI can be seen as a benefit, but can also be seen as scary. Right? And sometimes AI and technology used in warfare has been justified in a way to reduce, boots on the ground, right? With the use of drones, robots, etc. But interestingly enough, research has shown that those who operate drones, like, for example, soldiers and, who operate drones, who might be in an office in Philadelphia somewhere, but operating drones that are killing people in somewhere else, in Saudi Arabia, for example, or Middle East, or somewhere, right, suffer the same amount of stress and PTSD than pilots dropping bombs from their planes, right? I can't give you the source, but there is evidence to show that. Anyway, and I think we need to talk about asymmetries of power and the greed for power. So power is an interesting concept, right? We talk about it in different ways. We talk about empowering sort of women to be able to be agents of their own bodies, and which is great. That's a positive form of empowerment. But I think we can talk about asymmetries of power at very different levels. Between countries, within countries, between parties, within sort of organizations, within groups, within individuals, within families, whatever. I'm really concentrated on the power that is destructive, right? And I think the greed for power cannot be sort of, we need to think more seriously about how the greed for power is harmful, right? And I don't go into this very much at all, but patriarchy and the kudos associated with war. I think that's such another, big topic that is something that is not touched upon enough. And when I think about the kudos associated with war, by no means do I want to sort of denigrate or minimize the sacrifice that veterans do when they give up their lives to go and serve. But I think sometimes, as societies, we do give kudos to veterans, who do serve overseas, but in a way that doesn't sort of give us enough opportunity to step back and say, well, hang on a minute, should we be sending veterans or people to serve anyway? What could we do to actually avoid that, or even think that we could reduce our military substantially, those sort of things. I think it just doesn't allow us to think upon those decisions enough, right? Anyway, that's sort of, we can talk more about that in discussion as well. So who are we as humans, right? Well, I think evolutionary science suggests that humans are not predisposed to violence. Because many people will think that violence is the only way to respond to violence, and that is humans, we are violent. And that's also coming from Thomas Hobbes. So Thomas Hobbes was another important moral and political philosopher of his time in the 18th century, who wrote, so anyone who's taken an intro philosophy class may have read The Leviathan, which he wrote. This big sort of thick book, or excerpts from The Leviathan, probably, not the whole book. But he talks about the state of nature. And for Thomas Hobbes, the state of nature, humans in the state of nature, are nasty, aggressive, selfish, and brutish. And this is also, I think, something that we've carried with us. Right? And I sort of reject that notion as well. I think as humans, we can be either aggressive or we can be peaceful and compassionate, or both. Now, whether one is aggressive or compassionate is contingent on many factors. And of course, some of those include upbringing, education, society, culture, religion. Right? So once again, it's that sort of like thinking, challenging our own assumptions, our own beliefs about sort of, how we respond to things and how we can cultivate compassion and, and sort of trying to reduce the onset of violence. Right? I think the short-term, as I said before, the short-term impacts of war on the environment, war on the environment are obvious. So I'm not going to go there. What I'm going to just give you 3 examples that sort of express the long-term impact of war on the environment. Africa, Sardinia in Italy, and Palestine. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about military budgets and arms production, which are all part of the military exercise. So Jane Goodall spent many, many years as a primatologist in Tanzania, working and living with chimpanzees. And she said this about sort of the environment around her. In the 1960s, chimpanzee habitat stretched for miles. Forests also stretching for miles. Today, there's cultivated land, the trees have gone, the hillsides are eroded, and there's loss of soil fertility. Forest animals have gone too. And some of the causes of the devastation, well, one of the principal causes that Goodall has noticed in Tanzania over the years has been the influx of refugees, as well as general population increase. Refugees that have fled wars in Burundi, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and others. Refugees anywhere have a terrible struggle to survive. Right? They cut down trees for shelter and firewood, gather all kinds of edible plants, hunt wildlife for food, and of course it's going to have some detrimental impact on the environment. So Jane Goodall says this: scarcity of natural resources can actually trigger conflicts as well as prolonging existing wars. Wildlife, as well as innocent humans, are often maimed by landmines. Vast areas of farmland are made useless. People resort to illegal mining of valuable resources due to the instability caused by conflict. This, destroys the environment and kills off wildlife. Elephants are victims of the ivory trade. And poached ivory is used to fund wars. And over 64% of elephants in Central Africa have vanished in the past decade. In Tanzania, in just 5 years, the number of elephants dropped from 110,000 to just over 43,000. Sardinia, Italy, known as an island paradise off the coast of Italy, but it's also a place used to train soldiers and pilots. 70% of Italy's military bases are located in Sardinia. Italian and NATO bases occupy about 1/3 of the island's land. There's an epidemic of cancers and birth defects. Soil, air, food, and water is contaminated with heavy metals, jet fuel, napalm, and other poisons. Large quantities of toxic wastes are generated. Explosions of weapons and waste from past wars leave areas unable to support vegetation. Malformed animals are born near the military bases. And this is the largest airbase used by Italy, Germany, Canada, and the US since 1954. That's more than 70 years ago. So it doesn't need much to think about why it has such an impact on the environment. So the last one is Palestine. And I purposely put this image up there because I know that we could put up a similar image of Palestine in 2025. But I decided to put this one up, that is an image from 2014, just to highlight the fact that the situation in the occupied territories, West Bank and Gaza, has been going on for decades. And of course, the environmental impact this has had on the area has been devastating. So the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, both areas face water stress, right? 95% of the water in Gaza is unfit for human consumption. This was back in 2014, right? Groundwater is threatened by the contamination of wastewater and salinization. Land closure, confiscation, and the destruction of orchards in the West Bank has restricted grazing and agriculture, and has caused overgrazing in other areas and degraded soils. Solid waste management is poor across both areas. The Israeli dumping of toxic waste have been reported in the West Bank. Both Israeli and Palestinian industries have quarries which contribute to high levels of air pollution. And this is ongoing, right? It was probably worse now than ever. The management of the vast quantities of debris and contamination from the conflicts in Gaza is a persistent issue. So I've just given you 3 examples, right, of places around the world, but there are many, many, many more. I can think of Japan, Yemen, Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia. I mean, the list goes on, right? So I think it's not hard to see the impact that war has had for centuries, right? Okay, let's talk a little bit about military budgets. This is also nothing sort of new in a sense, right? But I think it's important just to sort of like emphasize the amount of money that is spent on the military. So the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, cost $1.5 trillion for the US, right? About twice the cost of the Vietnam War when adjusted for inflation. 1 out of every 5 tax dollars is spent on defense. And not surprisingly, the US spends more on its defense budget than the next 10 countries combined, including Russia, China, and allies. So this was the budget presented to the Biden administration in the financial, for this financial year. Now, to be honest, I'm not too sure what Trump is planning to do with this, right? But anyway, so I just wanted to keep this as is, because I think we don't really know what's going to happen. But so the government last year requested $845 billion for the Department of Defense. And if you just look at the breakdown, it's scary. $182 billion a year on military personnel, $338 billion a year on operations and maintenance, $168 billion a year on the procurement of weaponry and other equipment, and $143 billion a year on research, development, evaluation, etc. So a lot of tax dollars in the US is being invested in the military. So as we know, right, war has created and does create a global military empire that feeds the world's oil-based economies, 5.5% of green gas emissions is attributed to war. That's equivalent. That's equivalent to the amount that's attributed to air flying, right? But it's also equivalent to a sort of a reasonably sized country. Waging war is dependent on burning vast amounts of oil and generates high levels of greenhouse gases. And of course, increased military spending diverts funds from social, educational, health, and environmental needs. Imagine if just half of the budget that was proposed for military was spent on research on renewable energy, right? Or even on public transport infrastructure, or even on environmental education or programs in environmental studies, environmental sciences at universities. Not surprisingly, the United States is also the world's largest supplier of weapons. And these companies have benefited from the current wars because of the way that because of the US's involvement in providing arms and supplying arms to these countries. 9 of the world's biggest arms companies are based in the US. The US has a 42% share of the global market. And in 2022, the revenues for the biggest arms companies totaled $597 billion. So once again, we're talking about big bucks, right, in this area. And it's, I'd hate to see the figures for 2024. So, I've given you sort of like a big picture view, right, sort of the situation. And it's sort of, I know it can seem like it's quite obvious, but I don't think what it means to me is that we're not doing enough to really sort of respond to these issues, because, like it or not, we're in a climate crisis, right? So we have to do something to respond to it, right? And I think one of the ways. Well, one of the first things we need to do is understand the situation. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to help us all understand the situation a bit more. There is an urgent need to better understand the impact of war on the environment, but also our relationship with the environment. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time. I want to tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that. So when I teach environmental philosophy or sustainability, I ask my students, how do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as part of the environment? And maybe I can ask the students here now, right? Or even many of you. How do you see yourself? Do you see yourselves as part of the environment? Like separate from the environment? Or as part of the environment? Because I think, and it's interesting, some students will actually say they've seen that they think about themselves as separate to the environment. And I think we've got to start thinking about, and I'm sure some of you will say that you feel part of the environment, and that's great, because I think that's how we should be thinking. As humans, we are only one part of the environment. The environment is made up of many parts, right? But we can't see ourselves as separate to it. And why I think that's important, because how we understand our relationship with the environment is going to determine how we address it, or how we care for it, or what we do to it. So there's like that cause and effect. Right? So that's why I think if we think a little bit more about our relationship with the environment, it's going to help us understand it a bit more. And also realize that we have to care for it in a better way. Okay, so understanding is not enough, right? It's not going to get us far. It is a necessary but insufficient condition. And I think there needs to be a realization that continued warfare will only act as a catalyst towards climate disasters. I mean, that's just, I think we're just going to make that more visible. There is a compelling need for action, and this is where I get stuck, right? Because I sort of work on a big picture thing. I look at the world and I think, oh my gosh, it's, I can get lost in the up in the sky, not even in the forest, right? I can get lost in the sky, looking down at the forest, because I sort of think, wow, how do we do this, right? And many of us, and I'm sure many of you who are taking environmental studies or involved in anything to do with the environment, whether it's marine biology, marine science, have a deep, deep care and love for the environment. But what we do as individuals is not enough, right? What the changes that are going to require are going to be, yes, it will require individual changes, but it's also going to require structural changes. And I think sometimes the power of nonviolence is underestimated. Often I hear it. No, violence is the only way you can respond to violence. Well, I also do some volunteer work. My peace activism work comes from Michigan. When I was a grad student, I got involved with, it's an organization called Meta Peace Team. And they do a lot on peace accompaniment. They've been sending peace teams over to Gaza for years, right? Helping farmers, Palestinian farmers, harvest their olives, right? So it's in a peace and accompaniment. But as part of that sort of peace organization, they also offer a lot of nonviolence training in the de-escalation of violence and sort of how to respond to violence. So I do think that there is, and studies have also shown that nonviolence resistance and nonviolence revolutions actually do work. And that's not to say that violence may not occur during that, but I think if we just think that violence is the only response to violence, then we go nowhere. We've got to change the way we think. And then the moral, I sort of, one of the things that I really think is happening at the moment, I talk about the moral compass of most sort of global leaders. And I'd probably say maybe all of us needs recalibration. I sort of think our compass is just going around in a circle. It hasn't got a North Star. We don't know where we're going. And I forgot to mention when I was talking about sort of who we are as humans, I think sometimes, as humans, as I said before, we're endowed with that sort of faculty to deliberate and make rational decisions, etc., etc. But we also have this sort of moral intuition, if you like. That gut feeling that, I've just done something that's not quite right there. Right? So I think that is something that we have to, be aware of, but also, and that's where I think that at the end of the day, we as humans do care about what we do and about others. We've just got to make it a little bit more sort of part of who we are. Right? So before I go into this, I just wanted to there are a couple of other things that I wanted to share with you. So back in January, the scientists from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the Doomsday Clock, declared that the world is at 89 minutes before midnight. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Doomsday Clock, but it was something that was created in 1947 by Einstein, and I can't remember who else it was. What's his name? Oppenheimer, right? When they didn't want sort of after the nuclear devastations of the Second World War, they thought maybe we shouldn't be doing this again, right? So they created the Doomsday Clock to alert humanity to the dangers of nuclear warfare. And it started, when it was first created, it was 7.5 minutes to midnight. And since 1947, it's been getting closer to midnight. And interestingly enough, now the scientists say that nuclear warfare is not the only fear. It's also climate crisis. It's also pandemics. It's also artificial intelligence. Right? So it's interesting to see how that has sort of spread out. Right? And a couple of other facts. Global conflict has doubled over the past 5 years. 1 in 8 people worldwide were exposed to conflict. Right? That's crazy, right? And one of the things that really worries me at the moment with the climate crisis, which is another thing that I don't think we're talking enough about, is the global refugee crisis. And it has a direct link with war and, of course, the environment. The United Nations at the moment says that currently there are 122.6 million displaced people around the world. And these displaced people are displaced because of violence, conflict, persecution, war, and environment. Actually, climate refugees aren't considered refugees because it's not part of the convention. I think we have to work on that, making it sort of part of the convention. But anyway, we can talk about that too. But that's only going to get worse with continued warfare and with continued climate disasters. So there's a sort of like a tension or a contradiction, if you like, between nationalism and the global refugee crisis. Because with nationalism, countries are bringing in stricter immigration policies, putting up walls and saying, we don't want you. Yet, millions and millions of people around the world are displaced and need a home. And as I said, that's going to increase. And so I sort of think, hang on a minute, there's something not quite right here. Right? So I think it's something that we need to think about. Anyway, so a concluding thought. This I thought was interesting because, well, it's also a bit depressing as well, because this was written in 1982 in a Friends of the Earth magazine. And they said then, we need a profound change, a new political language that recognizes that real security emerges only when nations befriend each other. Belligerency, competition for resources on a finite planet, exploitation of people and nature are behaviors that have failed. They are out of date. We need to seek people skilled in the arts of peace, accommodation, compromise, not shy to speak of love for all creatures and for whom war is a violation of natural law, a breakdown of the civilized experiment. We need to articulate a system of values that reflect this. So it can be a little bit disillusioning because they wrote back that that was back in 1982. Has anything changed? 2025. So I would welcome you some thoughts and suggestions on what do we need to do, apart from, well, maybe it is time for a revolution. Right? I'm going to leave you with these final thoughts. I did want to leave on a more of a hopeful note. Right? Anyway, I don't think I can. But war is a kind of destruction, both intended and unintended. War destroys the environment. War is always war on the environment. Thanks.